Quarter 2 Geometry, Unit 6, all about similarity. In this unit, we're talking about how different polygons can be similar. Now, this is different from congruent, and we'll get to that in Section 2. But here in Section 1, we're talking all about ratios and proportions, which should be a little bit of review, but will be a big part of similar figures. So, to start with some definitions, a ratio is a comparison of two numbers. And the notation we use for that can be a couple different things. We'll typically use the notation x over y, so a number over another number. You could also do a colon to say that x to y, or you can just use words and say x to y. And those are forms of notation for a ratio. Now a proportion is two ratios in an equation. And that'll become a little more clear once we do an example. But it's to say that we'll have a couple ratios and we can show how they're related using a proportion. And the last thing is a cross product property, which is something you're probably familiar with in that it's just cross multiplying. And we'll use that a lot when we're talking about proportions. So just a refresher, to cross multiply is to say that if we have the ratio a over b and c over d, and we make it into proportion by saying that those two are equal, we can solve for any of the letters we want by doing cross multiplying. So we can know that b times c is equal to a times d, and that will prove to be very useful and powerful for us as we're solving for different values. So let's start with example number 1. Betty's Bagels kept track of its sales for just one day, and the data is reflected in the table below. So we have 6 different kinds of bagels, and it tells us how many they sold in one day. So the first question is, what is the ratio of plain bagels sold to sesame bagels? So a ratio would be a number over a number. And so we're thinking of plain bagels, and it doesn't necessarily matter which one you put on top, but as long as you're consistent. So, plain bagels, we can see they sold 80 plain bagels in one day. So we'll have 80 on the top to how many sesame bagels? It looks like they sold 25. And so when we're doing these ratios, we're always going to simplify it down. And since they both can be divided by 5 evenly, we're going to simplify it down to 16 over 5, since 80 divided by 5 is 16 and 25 divided by 5 is 5. So that's to say that for every 16 plain bagels that were sold, 5 of those were sesame bagels. And the next question is, what is the ratio of garlic bagels sold to the total number of bagels sold in that one day? This is a similar problem, but just thinking about over the total rather than comparing two specific kinds of bagels. So I start the same way with figuring out how many garlic bagels were sold, and it looks like 20. And then to figure out the total, it doesn't tell me what the total is, but if I add all of the bagels that were sold, I can figure out the total sold in the day, and I find that's 250. So I can do 20 over 250, which can be simplified down. I can take the zeros off or divide both of them by 10 to get 2 over 25. So that's to say 2 out of every 25 bagels sold were garlic bagels. And our last question, if during a week Betty sold 2,200 total bagels, how many of them are whole grain? So this is when we're going to use a proportion. Now when we're doing a proportion, it doesn't necessarily matter, again, which one we put on top as long as we're consistent. So I'm going to make myself a key that I'm going to do whole grain over the total. I'm going to be consistent with that. So when I set up my proportion, I'm going to set up the proportion of one day. So from my data, I know that 45 whole grain bagels were sold out of every 250. And that should be equal to what they sell in a week, which is 2,200 bagels, and I want to figure out how many whole grain bagels are sold in a week. And so I use my cross product property and cross multiply. So I have 250 times x is equal to 45 times 200, or 2,200. So I take 45 times 2,200, and that equals 99,000. And that still equals 250x. If I divide both sides by 250, I get that x equals 396 whole grain bagels. So that's to say that if 2,200 total bagels are sold in a week, 396 of those should be whole grain bagels. That's a very clear application of how to use proportions and ratios in real life. So stay tuned for the next few videos, which are all examples of how we use ratios and proportions.